On August 14, 1945, Japanese Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks engaged Soviet T-34-85s at Sutarling with 47mm guns that could not penetrate frontal armor at any practical range, while 85mm Soviet shells punched through 25mm Japanese armor at distances up to 2,000 meters. The engagement crystallized 8 years of industrial miscalculation that began at Khalkhin Gol, where approximately 120 Japanese tanks fell to Soviet forces in mechanical slaughter that exposed every weakness of imperial armor doctrine. Japan's answer to the Soviet armored threat had become a monument to the fundamental mismatch between engineering ambition and industrial capacity, fielded in quantities insufficient against an enemy producing substantial numbers of superior tanks monthly. The crisis that birthed the Chi-Ha traced to the catastrophic tank battles at Khalkhin Gol in 1939, where approximately 100 to 120 Japanese tanks fell to Soviet forces in a mechanical slaughter that exposed every weakness of imperial armor doctrine. The Type 89 I-Go medium tank, Japan's primary armored weapon since 1929, mounted a 57mm Type 90 low-velocity gun, firing shells at limited velocity, achieving minimal penetration at 500 meters against vertical steel plate. Soviet BT-7 fast tanks, armed with 45mm guns, outranged Japanese 37mm and 57mm armament, destroying numerous Ha-Go light tanks during the extended engagement. Japanese crews found their standard weapons transformed overnight from infantry support tools to death traps, capable only of flanking shots against BT-5 and T-26 tanks, whose 13 to 20mm side armor they could barely penetrate at 300 meters. The Kwantung Army's intelligence reports from September 1939, written after the encirclement closed, documented the arithmetic of defeat with brutal clarity. Soviet tank crews engaged Japanese armor at varying ranges, distances where Japanese guns achieved no penetration, while 45mm Soviet shells punched through Type 89 frontal armor like paper. The 25 km/h top speed of the I-Go made tactical repositioning impossible against BT series tanks advancing at 50 km/h across Mongolian steppes. When the final accounting closed, Japan had lost approximately 100 to 120 tanks destroyed and captured, equipment representing significant production from Mitsubishi's Nagoya works and the Sagami arsenal. Japanese engineers received the challenging brief at Mitsubishi workshops in the mid-1930s, as reports from border skirmishes revealed the inadequacy of existing Japanese armor. The development team faced Army specifications demanding a 15-ton medium tank with 25mm frontal armor, 40 km/h road speed, and a gun capable of defeating contemporary Soviet armor at combat range. The deadline allowed limited time from contract signature to prototype delivery, with production authorization dependent on successful trials at the Army Technical Research Institute's Sagami Proving Grounds. If you're fascinated by how engineering constraints and industrial capacity shape military outcomes, subscribe now and turn on notifications for more deep dives into the weapons that decided wars. The engineering solution emerged from the fundamental limitations of Japanese heavy industry in 1937. The 15,000-kilogram weight ceiling reflected Japanese Empire rail transport restrictions, where gauge limitations could not support heavier vehicles without infrastructure upgrades Japan could not afford. The 25mm armor specification balanced protection against weight, providing immunity to Soviet rifle-caliber anti-tank weapons, while remaining vulnerable to dedicated 45mm tank guns. The 47mm Type 97 gun mounted in production models fired armor-piercing shells at moderate velocity, achieving limited penetration at combat ranges against vertical homogeneous steel plate. The chassis incorporated 6 small road wheels per side with bell crank suspension, a system requiring 120 bogie arms and 22 return rollers per vehicle, but offering superior cross-country mobility over the Type 89's rigid truck springs. The Mitsubishi Type 100 12-cylinder air-cooled diesel engine produced approximately 170 horsepower, giving the completed tank a power-to-weight ratio of 11.3 horsepower per ton and a maximum road speed of 38 kilometers per hour. The four-man crew consisted of commander/gunner, loader, driver, and hull machine gunner, operating a 7.7mm Type 97 machine gun with 3,000 rounds of ammunition stored in the fighting compartment. Prototype trials at Sagami in early 1937 revealed the fundamental compromise embedded in the design. The 47mm gun achieved the specified penetration against test plates, but ballistic calculations showed it could not defeat the sloped armor of newer Soviet designs, observed in reconnaissance reports. The Type 97's muzzle velocity fell short of the 600 to 700 meters per second achieved by contemporary German and Soviet tank guns. When the Army adopted the design in December 1937, ordnance officials understood they were fielding a weapon already approaching obsolescence, but industrial capacity offered no alternative. The Type 97 Chi-Ha measured approximately 5.5 meters in overall length, including gun overhang, with a hull length of approximately 4.7 meters and width of approximately 2.2 meters, fitting standard rail gauge requirements. Combat weight reached approximately 15,000 kilograms, with full fuel and ammunition load, distributed across a ground pressure of 0.76 kilograms per square centimeter that allowed operation in soft terrain where heavier vehicles would bog down. The main armament carried substantial rounds of mixed ammunition, typically armor-piercing and high-explosive shells, with a sustained rate of fire limited to 8 rounds per minute by the manual loading system and the gun's violent recoil mechanism. Production began at Mitsubishi's Nagoya works in late 1937 with initial orders, expanding as the China incident escalated. Each tank required extensive manufacturing time for completion, with complex processes for hull and turret riveting, engine installation, chassis assembly, and armament integration. The riveted armor construction, chosen over welding to reduce manufacturing time, created weak points at plate joints where 45mm shells could achieve penetration through structural failure rather than direct armor defeat. The Imperial Japanese Army's regulations for tank operations, revised in 1942 following Khalkhin Gol lessons, prescribed defensive employment for the Type 97 Chi-Ha in company-strength formations of 3 to 4 tanks. The doctrine specified maximum engagement ranges of 500 meters against Soviet armor, with crews trained to aim for tracks and suspension components rather than attempting frontal penetration of T-34 armor. Tank companies were to be positioned in hull-down defensive positions along prepared lines, supporting infantry rifle companies rather than conducting independent armored operations. The Kwantung Army's July 1945 Directive for Tank Employment reflected the recognition that Japanese armor could no longer engage Soviet tanks directly. The order specified that Type 97 Chi-Has were to be held in concealed positions and committed only after Soviet armor had been weakened by anti-tank gunfire and infantry weapons. This represented an explicit acknowledgement that the Chi-Ha's 47mm gun could not penetrate T-34-85 frontal armor at any practical range, with crews instructed to target immobilized vehicles rather than attempt penetration of operational Soviet tanks. The engagement at Sutao-Ling on August 14, 1945, demonstrated the futility of Japanese anti-tank doctrine against Soviet mechanized forces. Japanese anti-tank guns and suicide bombers engaged Soviet tank brigades advancing southward from the greater Khingan Range, destroying 21 T-34-85s through desperate defensive measures. Japanese records indicate that Soviet T-34-85s opened fire at extended ranges, destroying multiple Japanese positions in the opening engagement, while suffering significant losses to Japanese return fire. The Type 97's 47mm gun
proved incapable of penetrating T-34-85 frontal armor at combat range, but could achieve side and rear penetration at close distances. The Soviet tank's armor sloped at steep angles, presented significant effective thickness, while the Chi-Ha's armor-piercing shell achieved limited penetration at combat ranges.
Soviet crews described Japanese shells bouncing off their hulls like pebbles, while 85mm ZIS S-53 guns, firing 9.8 kg projectiles at 780 meters per second, penetrated Japanese 25mm armor at maximum engagement range. The Soviet Union implemented no special countermeasures against the Type 97 Chi-Ha threat because standard T-34-85 capabilities already exceeded Japanese penetration by significant margins. Soviet operations orders mandated engagement ranges of 1,500 to 2,000 meters against Japanese medium tanks, exploiting the 85mm gun's superior penetration while remaining immune to Japanese fire. Soviet forces maintained standard ammunition loads with adequate armor-piercing capability against any Japanese armor. The industrial arithmetic that doomed Japanese armor became clear in the production comparison between Chi-Ha manufacturing and Soviet T-34-85 mass production. Each Type 97 Chi-Ha required extensive manufacturing time for completion at significant unit cost, rising further by July 1944 due to steel shortages and inflation. Mitsubishi's Nagoya plant achieved limited monthly production rates in 1942, falling further by 1945 as bombing disrupted supply chains and skilled workers were transferred to aircraft production. Soviet tank plants produced T-34-85s through optimized manufacturing processes by mid-1945, achieving substantial monthly output rates through mass production assembly lines. The Chi-Ha's riveted armor construction required precision fitting of numerous individual plates, while the T-34's welded hull used large rolled sections that reduced part count and assembly time. Total Japanese tank production from 1943 to 1945 reached limited numbers across all factories, while Soviet production exceeded Japanese totals significantly. The economic disparity extended beyond manufacturing to operational capability. Germany's response to Soviet armor had forced the Wehrmacht to retrofit entire tank fleets with side-skirts and applique armor, diverting substantial steel and thousands of workshop hours to defend against weapons like the 14.5mm PTRD anti-tank rifle. Japan's Chi-Ha represented no threat requiring countermeasures, allowing Soviet industry to focus resources on offensive weapons rather than defensive modifications. The Type 97 Chi-Ha's brief post-war service with Chinese forces during the Civil War demonstrated the weapon's obsolescence against even second-line equipment. Captured Chi-Ha's transferred to various forces in 1946, served through the late 1940s, but their combat record showed consistent failure against nationalist M4 Shermans and M3 Stuart light tanks. During extended campaigns, Chi-Ha's achieved limited success against soft targets, but lost multiple tanks to Kuomintang anti-tank weapons. Combat use continued through 1948, during various Civil War campaigns, when armored units equipped with surviving Chi-Ha's engaged nationalist forces across northern China. Chinese records show no penetrations achieved beyond 100 meters against M4 Sherman frontal armor, with 47mm shells bouncing harmlessly off 50mm glacis plates sloped at 45 degrees. By January 1949, the forces had retired all Chi-Ha's to training roles, replacing them with T-34-85s that offered 3 times the penetration and twice the armor protection. The arithmetic of the Manchurian campaign tells the complete story of Japanese armored warfare's collapse. 1,200 tanks in position on August 9th became 600 captured intact by late August, with additional numbers destroyed or abandoned during the Soviet advance. The Type 97 Chi-Ha, designed in 1937 as Japan's elite medium tank, had become a relic by 1945, outclassed by every category of Soviet armor and incapable of meaningful resistance against an enemy that crossed the greater Khingan Range in 5 days, rather than the predicted 3 weeks. The weapon succeeded not through technical excellence, but through adequate performance against Chinese forces lacking modern anti-tank weapons. Against the Soviet Union's industrialized war machine, producing substantial numbers of tanks monthly, Japan's limited tank production represented a fundamental mismatch of industrial capacity that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the weapons and mathematics that decided the Pacific War, hit subscribe for more military history every week. Thanks for watching.